Friday was Beizir, and Friday we learned a Maimer. So we learned a Maimer. And did we ever struggle with that Maimer? But I promised you then that on Sunday, Belinede, we would do something on the Rebbe MaHaRaSh. It was the birthday of the Rebbe MaHaRaSh. This past Friday was the birthday of the Rebbe MaHaRaSh, and he was born in Tzadik Daled. Tzadik Daled Chap Zifel, 179 years ago, he was born. According to one of the Rebbe's notes, the conception, the pregnancy started on his birthday a year earlier, Tzadik Gimel. This is 180 years ago. Beizir was the Ibor of Eshtet, in one of the Rebbe's notes, the Ibor of the Rebbe MaHaRaSh. In the beginning of the Hayim Yem, you have a brief biography of every Rebbe. It's called Kevit Shalshelas Hayachas. The Rebbe, our Rebbe, who prepared the Hayim Yem, one of the things that he included was a brief biography of all the Rabbeim, beginning with the Alter Rebbe. So Yud Shvat, we did the Frierdiker Rebbe, it went nice. So I figured, that's what we'll do. We'll go through all the Rabbeim, Mitzvah Shem Beli Neder, of course. Whenever we have a Yortzeit or a Yem who led us, we'll learn about that Rebbe in the Hakdama of the Hayim Yem. So we're going to do today the Rebbe MaHaRaSh. Okay, so you see where I'm starting, by the Dalet. Hoid Kvegedushas Admor. Hoid means the light, the shine of the Holy Rebbe. Marano v'Rabbono Shmuel. Our master, our teacher Shmuel. Neilad b'Lubavitch, was born in Lubavitch, Beizir Tovkuf Tzalidal. The second day of the year, in the year Tovkuf Tzalidal. That would be 1834. In the Hayom Yom proper, if you look inside the Hayom Yom itself, it says Beizir Tovkuf Tzadik Gimel, which is 1833. And like I said to you before, the Rebbe has a footnote where he writes Ulay Akavon al Ha'ibad. That's a reference to the pregnancy. I want to tell you this word before I continue. The Rebbe Chaim used to say to the MaHaRaSh, Dir aber gehat auf a zip bet. That's the Lashon. The Rebbe Chaim used to say to her son, the Rebbe MaHaRaSh, Dir aber gehat auf a zip bet. I delivered you on a zip bet. Zip bet means a bed that was a sieve, a filter, a sifter. What was the story? The story was that, as was part of life, there were fires in Lubavitch. The Tzemach Tzedek had his house rebuilt, remodeled. If I recall correctly, that it was not a fire, he just expanded what they call the Chotzer to accommodate the more Chassidim, the greater family. So they had an old house and they had a new house. All in the same courtyard, in the same square block. Another corner. And the new home was not ready for living yet. They couldn't move in. And the Pesach Kalim were kept there. In other words, the family was living in the old house. Most of Tzemach Tzedek's children, by the time that Rebbe MaHaRaSh was born, were already married men. But they were living in the old house, and they were still in the process of building the new Dira. And the pace of the Kekalim were in the new Dira. The Rebbe Chayamushka insisted that she's going to have her baby in the new house. This is what she insisted. She went into labor. So she ran to the new house. There wasn't a bed to lay on, verstehst? But the Pesach of the Kekalim were there. Amongst the Pesach of the Kekalim was a zip bet. I've never seen a zip bet, but it's essentially 4 legs and steingen, 2 boards, and a huge cloth that sifts, and the whole bed is a sifter. And that's what Rebbe MaHaRaSh was born. So she used to say, Did aber gehat auf a zip bet. Why am I telling this to you now? Because I would forget to tell it to you later. It's just one of those little details. It's brought in the Siches. I didn't make up the story, so I must have a toich. The Frierdiker Rebbe tells the story. That's not from Chassidim. The Frierdiker Rebbe himself that told the Maise, at the Rebbe Chaim used to tell her son, the Rebbe MaHaRaSh, Dir aber gehat auf a zip bet. That's the story. Now, in the Sefer Migaleis, Shia Munchen collected all kinds of Rishimis. He brings over there, in the name of one of the Chassidim, that the Rebbe MaHaRaSh was born Shalei Al Pi Teva. The Rebbetzin was way past 40. And in those years, way past 40 is not like today, way past 40. Forget, in our society today, people are first having their first child. Way past 40. like Sarah and Yitzchak. Acharei Bloisi. Acharei Bloisi. B'terech hatava, she was no longer ovulating. Acharei Bloisi hoysel li yedna. The MaHaRaSh was born shalei apiteva. And now that he's the only Rebbe who was born from a Rebbe once the Rebbe was already Rebbe. You understand? The MaHaRaSh was not only a Rebbe, Ben Rebbe, he wasn't only the Rebbe, the son of a Rebbe, but he was conceived and born once his father was already a Rebbe. The Rebbe Rashab was born before the Rebbe Rashab, before the Rebbe MaHaRaSh was a Rebbe. The Frierdiker Rebbe was born before the Rebbe Rashab was a Rebbe. But the Rebbe MaHaRaSh was conceived and born by an already presiding Rebbe. The only Chabad Nasi that has that distinction is the Rebbe MaHaRaSh. He was born when his father was already a Rebbe. So obviously, Lubavitch became a party, a carnival. Thousands of Chassidim came. The Rebbe Sabris, not a Einikol, Tianur Einikol. The Rebbe had a child, right? Anyway, he was born Beis here. As we know, he was born Tiferes Sheba Tiferes, right after Pesach. And Chassidim came, and of course they prepared the huge bris and to feed everybody. And we have to remember also it's Hakel 6 years since the Mittler Rebbe passed away. You've gone through that crowd and asked people to lay bets. What is going to be the name of this child? Who you'd have heard one single choice. Of course, Dave Ber. Was für a Scheile? Das ist the Mamale Mokim for the Mittler Rebbe. This is his first son born since the Stalks of the Mittler Rebbe. It was only 6 years since the Mittler Rebbe passed away. No one would have dreamed that this child would not be named Dave Ber. And the whole day started off funny. They davened. And after davening, he came to the bris. The Tzemach Tzedek also davened. And after davening, he announces Heinz Vatzayin the bris, and he goes into his room. Today is going to be the bris, and he goes to his room. That's a funny announcement to make before an obvious, today we're going to eat breakfast. Heinz Vatzayin the bris. When kommt nicht aus vom Zimmer. He's not coming. Anyway, the Chassidim sat and sat and sat and sat. They're not eating. So they verbringt. And there were a lot of, the Tzemach Tzedek's children were all there. The Tzemach Tzedek's Vetter, Reb Chaim Avraham, the Malten Rebbe's Zun, was there as well. And they were sitting and verbringing and schmoozing back and forth, back and forth. After a few hours, Tzemach Tzedek opens up his door and says, today is going to be the bris, and he goes back to his room. Anyway, at a certain point, they realized something is happening. They actually got a heter or a shus. They washed and they ate. We sit a whole day and fast. The bris was at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. A few minutes to 4, Tzemach Tzedek came out of room and says, Magait Shoin Machen the bris. And he went to the Rebbetzin to discuss the name. He went to speak to his Rebbetzin about the name. They did the bris, and the Tzemach Tzedek gave him a name Shmuel. And the room gasped. Shmuel? Where does Shmuel land on Lubavitch? Shmuel? And Derech Agav, the Tzemach Tzedek had a seder that he would give each one of his children and grandchildren a name and immediately give them an abbreviation. So I'm imagining he called him Shmuel and then he said MaHaRaSh. Chassidim were not allowed to call the children from the Beis Harab by their names, even the infants. They had to call them by the kinui. When the Rebbe MaHaRaSh was a little boy, they called him MaHaRaSh. If you called him Shmuel, the Rebbe MaHaRaSh once opened up his window when he heard the Radatz calling the Rebbe Nishmaseit Shalom Ber. He said, "Ich will sein welcher chutzpahnik ruft on Tzadke Mishpacha bam Nomen." You were not allowed to say the names of the Rabbeim's children and grandchildren even when they were babies. You had to say the nickname, the kinur that Tzemach Tzedek gave them. Now in Yudel Chitrik Sefer he had something which doesn't say in the Neshimis, that he gave him a name, Shmuel, and then you heard the Rebbe MaHaRaSh muttering under his breath, Polotz kechevre kadishe taka hele kechevre aber afeile chevre. He mutters to himself, the undertakers of Polotsk are taka a holy society, but they're lazy. Anyway, B'shas and Bris, B'shas and Sudas Bris, so of course the Tzemach Tzedek said Chassidus, and Verbracht. So the Maharil, who was the Tzemach Tzedek's son, says to his father, where does this name come from? Efshe noch Shmuel Novi. Maybe you named after Shmuel Novi. But the Tzemach Tzedek sagt, name. Noch Havase Träger in Polotsk. I named him after a water carrier in Polotsk, who was a Boki B'shas Bavli and Yerushalmi. He was a Tzaddik Nisted, he knew Kol HaTeira Kula, and he passed away that day. And the Tzemach Tzedek was waiting for Stimas Agelu. You can't give a name until that person is buried. And in Polis there were 2 Levias that day, and the other Levi was a rich man, which was attended by everybody. Who knew who this water carrier was? So the Levi didn't finish till 4 in the afternoon. So Tzemach Tzedek was waiting for an email, waiting for a text, he was waiting for a fax. But the Mshem Bagrabim can't get Manomen. We had the Tzemach Tzedek knew. Yeah. But it is true, nevertheless, that when the MaHaRaSh was a boy, 6 or 7 years old, Rosh Hashanah, and he was reading the story of Shmuel and Chana, and you have over there where Chana tells Eli HaKayin, I swear, El Hanar Azeh Hispalolti, that I davened for this child. So the Tzemach Tzedek said the pasuk, and as he said the words El Hanar Azeh Hispalolti, the people who were close were Mesim Lev that he pointed at the Rebbe MaHaRaSh, whose name was also Shmuel, El Hanar Azeh Hispalolti. And the MaHaRaSh was born. He was Ben Skunim for sure. He grew up with his nephews, who were all older than him, and he was such a lovable child. And people used to come to Lubavitch. One of the most favorite parts of any visit Lubavitch was to Tzadkenzach, to play around with Rebbe's Ben Skunim. He was very social, very comfortable with himself, very precocious, very outgoing, and he verbringt, and he was a kind. And he was a wunder child. There's some wonderful stories tell about his childhood, all kinds of different things. They tell us about his childhood. In the Rebbe's Hashimis, there's such a sharfe Sachen, where he was sitting in Cheder with his nephews. His nephews, who with all due respect, were going to go on to become Rebbes. And he used to complain that he's sitting in a class full of dumbbells, you understand? The Malamed once asked a question, and the Rebbe MaHaRaSh said, I know the answer, and I'm not going to say. And he's sitting there all the while, taking apart a pocket watch and putting it back together. He was always busy with gadgets. He was always playing with things. So as the Malamed, he's playing with his pocket. He doesn't even look up. I know the answer, I'm not going to say. And he used to make fun of his nephews. They were 4 years older than him, 3 years older than him. So Aminut, one time, so the Maril came to the Cheder. His older brother came to the Cheder to protest to the Malamed. And this little boy making trouble. His chutzpah of it. So he comes into the Cheder, and he complains in front of the Rebbe MaHaRaSh to the Malamed about how the Rebbe MaHaRaSh is not being sensitive to his boys, and he's embarrassing them. So the Rebbe MaHaRaSh gave him a delectable insult. He told him something such classic. And the Mariv, got an asponim. A chutzpah, he talks this way to his big brother. So without hesitating, the Rebbe MaHaRaSh, and all the while he's playing with his pocket watch, he's taking it apart and putting it back together. The S from Kabed Es Avicha Vesimecha gedenkt aber the Kabed, the S Havaya lekach atira te vergessen. Kabed Es Avicha Vesimecha, so whatever, there's a long complication, but S means you have to respect your older brother. Yeah. But Es Hashem lekach atira means L'Rabes Talmidei Chachamim. He says he remembers the Kabed Es. The kid was 7. He's telling his married brother, "Have derechet shmich matam tchacham." You understand? This was the Rebbe MaHaRaSh. As a sharfer kid. He tells him, "You're worried about the fact that I'm not honoring you because you're my big brother, but you have to honor me because I'm a bigger tam chacham than you." He was 7 years old. Es l'rabes talmidei chachamim. Es Hashem lekecha tira l'rabes talmidei chachamim. And like I said, there's many stories about his childhood. I don't know when, but as a young person, he got sick. And apparently he hid his illnesses from his father, from the Tzemach Tzedek. By the time the Tzemach Tzedek became aware of his illnesses, the Tzemach Tzedek was not able to help him. Tzemach Tzedek says he wished he had known. Had he known, he would have given him Arichas Yamim at least as long as Shmuel HaNavi, which is 52 years. Lepeli lived only 47 years, something like that. He didn't have Arichas Yamim. He was very, very sick. As a young person, he was ill, and he hid it from his own father. One of the amazing stories of the Rebbe MaHaRaSh, which is in the Rebbe's diary, is that the Tzemach Tzedek called in his son, the Rebbe MaHaRaSh, and says to him, "Why don't you work hard on Limud HaTorah?" The Rebbe MaHaRaSh had an incredible mind. Unbelievable mind. It was very fast and very deep, and everything was easy. And the Tzemach Tzedek said to his son, so the Rebbe MaHaRaSh took it as a hero, and he started the Horavan Torah. It took 3 days, and he developed blood clots on his forehead from concentration. Wrinkles, lines of blood on his forehead from concentration. Tzemach Tzedek does their zen. The Tzemach Tzedek saw this. Tzemach Tzedek called him again, and he changed his mind. And he gave him a different derech and teira. He saw what happened. 3 days, Gehadavet and Len, he developed blood clots on his forehead. This is Rebbe MaHaRaSh. Now let's read weiter. Noso bezivegrischen es bas achiv. In his first marriage, he married his niece, his brother's daughter. His brother's name was Admor Rab Chaim Shnei Zalman. He was exactly 20 years older than him. Chaim Shnei Zalman was named after Alter Rebbe, which was born in Ayin Dalet in 1804. And the Rebbe MaHaRaSh was born in 1814. The Rebbe MaHaRaSh was born in 1834. There was 20 years difference. But the Chaim Shnei Zalman was already married with children. And the Chaim Shnei Zalman's daughter was the same age, was Bas Gil as the Rebbe MaHaRaSh. And they got married. And there's a kuntres called Harabonis Rivke, which a Fidik Rebbe wrote, which is mashma that there were 2 brothers that both had daughters. They both wanted the Rebbe MaHaRaSh al-Tzeidim, and the Rebbe MaHaRaSh took the Chaim Shnei Zalman. The other one was the Ravash. Our Rebbe is Elter Zaydim. Elter Zaydim. What happened was, right after Sheva Brachos, she got sick. And she passed away 3 months later. She's buried in the oil of the Noshim in Lubavitch. In Lubavitch is a section where all the Rebbetzins are. They made now a gate, you could see, it's a row. All the Rebbetzins. You can't even identify who they are. You just see old tombstones. You can't really read words. But they know where the spot is based on the map. You understand? They had the map. And they're reconstructing the cemetery without the tombstones. The tombstones were all vandalized, but they're reconstructing the cemetery based on the map. You understand? So there's 4 spots. They don't even know who are in those 4 spots. But Pashas, the middle of the Rebbe's Rebbetzin is there. Tzemach Tzedek's Rebbetzin would be buried here later on, the Rebbetzin Chaya Mushka. And the Rebbe MaHaRaSh's first Zivik is buried there as well. We don't even know her name. We don't even know her name. They lived a very short time together. The Seder was that the Tzemach Tzedek used to build for each one of his children a home. When they got married, he built them a home. Because he wanted very much they should live in Lubavitch. And all of his sons did, really. Till he passed away, all of his sons did, except for 2. He had a son named Rabbi Yankiv. We know very little about him. He was the closest in years to the Rebbe MaHaRaSh. He became a Rav, B'chaya, from the Tzemach Tzedek. And he passed away, B'chaya. He passed away before the Tzemach Tzedek. His name was Rabbi Yankiv. We know very little about him. He lived in another city. And there was also a brother named Rabbi Yosef Yitzchok, who moved away from Lubavitch. He lived in Avruch. But aside from those 2, all the children lived in Lubavitch as long as the Rebbe Tzemach Tzedek was alive. He built them a house. And in addition to the house, he built them right next door to that house a shul, Beth Medrash. And when the Chassidim used to come to the Tzemach Tzedek, to Lubavitch, in addition to going to the Rebbe, they would go to the Rebbe's children. Chassidim had favorites, you understand, different Chassidim. These Chassidim went to the Maharil, these Chassidim went to the Marshav, these Chassidim went to the Maharin, these Chassidim went to the Ravash, these Chassidim went to the Rebbe MaHaRaSh. Each Chassid had his followers. Each child had his followers. So Lubavitch was very dynamic. Everybody came to the Rebbe, and he had a Yechidus Bam Rebbe, Talzin his name. But in addition to being by the Rebbe, you would go to the Rebbe Sazun, one of the Rebbe's children, and they all had their own program. They had a house on one of the many streets in Lubavitch. I mean, the many streets. There were not 500 streets in Lubavitch, but there were different Gesalach. And each one had his own street with his own house and his own bismedish. When the Rebbe MaHaRaSh got married, the first time, the Tzemach Tzedek also built him a home and a shul. And that's where the Rebbe MaHaRaSh lived. When he lost his wife, Mamish, 3 months after the wedding, he was shattered. Subrochen. And he was so broken that his father was not able to console him. His father tried to take him out of his depression. He couldn't. He was subrochen. So the Tzemach Tzedek did for the Rebbe MaHaRaSh what he hadn't done for any one of his children. He built an extension to his own house in the Chotzer, and he invited the Rebbe MaHaRaSh to live with him. So the Rebbe MaHaRaSh moved back into his own parents' home. Over then he had a door, and there was 2 apartments, one side by side. This was the Tzemach Tzedek's house. This is the Rebbe MaHaRash's dira. When the Rebbe MaHaRaSh married the second time, he didn't go back to the house and the shul that was built for him in the Zivik Rishon. He continued living adjacent to his father. Taf Reish Ubezivik Sheni as a Rabbonis Rivka Taf Reish Tes. A year later, he married the second time, and this time he married a first cousin, Rebbetzin Rivka. She was a daughter of the Mittel Rebbe's daughter, as the Rebbe MaHaRaSh was the son of the Mittler Rebbe's daughter. Tzemach Tzedek married his niece, his cousin. Tzemach Tzedek, right? The Rebbe Tzemach Mushke was the Mittler Rebbe's tochter. So the two first cousins. Rebbe Tzemifke was a Yeshema. She was an orphan. She had a sister, an older sister named Gittel. They lost both of their parents as children. And when their parents passed away, after a short time, their grandmother, their maternal grandmother, the Mittler Rebbe's Rebbetzin, who was very much still alive, the Rebbetzin Shena, invited them to live with her in Lubavitch. She raised them. When the MaHaRaSh lost his first wife, she came to her son-in-law and said, Hezechain, I didn't mix in before, but it's a Zivik Sheni, to second marriage, you got to take one of my granddaughters for the Rebbe MaHaRaSh. So the Tzemach Tzedek said to her, Hezechain, I was offered 28,000 ruble, a madden, from such and such a city for him for a Zivik Sheni, yeah? Can you match it? 28,000 rubles, it's an Ashidis. So she says, no, but ich kann ihm geben 30 Jahre Eishes Chava Kechava. She lived with the Mittler Rebbe she lived with him for 40 years, but she said 30 years. I can give him 30 years, I have the power. A wife of a Rebbe is a Rebbe, a Rebbetzin is a Rebbe. 30 years, I lived 30 years with the Mittler Rebbe, I can give him that schus that I have, Eishes Chava Kechava. And the Tzemach Tzedek agreed. That was a deal. And they brought in both girls, and he chose the younger one. He promised the older one he'll make her a fine shidduch. He kept his word. And they got married. The day of the wedding, Tzemach Tzedek calls Rebbe MaHaRaSh and says, Geh sheina rein to the Baba, go into your grandmother right now, she should give you a bracha. So it's 1 o'clock in the afternoon or 11 o'clock in the morning. Rebbe MaHaRaSh goes into the Baba, to the kitchen. They had a big kitchen, they had to cook for hundreds and hundreds of people. And she was the senior matriarch, she was the Baba. She was the mother of the Rebbe Chaim Mushke. She was the Tzemach Tzedek Shviger. She was Tzemach Tzedek Rebbetzin's mother. So she's running the whole kitchen. She's wearing an apron. Her hands are dirty. And there's the chassan, all of 15 years old, in the kitchen asking from her grandmother for a bracha. He says, now? Before the chuppah, I'll get dressed. I'll wash myself. I'll give you a bracha. So he goes back to the Tzemach Tzedek and says, the Baba says, I'll give a bracha for the chuppah. Tzemach Tzedek says, no, now. I don't know why, but he wanted mamish right then, a mittentag. So he goes back to the kitchen, he tells his grandmother, now. And she laughs and she says, no, before the chuppah. So he stood there in the middle of the kitchen. On the day of his wedding, he just stood and stood and stood. Anyway, she was a shneerson, but so was he. And when she saw that he wasn't going away, she went and she washed her hands. She took out a siddur, I'm sure she said some kind of a nusach. Then she took her heilige hand, the middle of the Rebbe's Rebbetzin, she put them on the Rebbe MaHaRaSh's head, and she gave him a bracha, and she said, 30 years, the wife of a Rebbe's Rebbe, I'm giving you. And when he went out of the kitchen, the Tzemach Tzedek summoned him and said, so what did she say? And he said what she said, and the Tzemach Tzedek was very happy. This is what happened. They got married. They should know the relationship that the Rebbe MaHaRaSh had with the Rebbe Rivka was very, very, very unusual. She was a Yosema. She didn't grow up in a normal home. She was an orphan from childhood. So she told her grandson, the Rebbe, the Friedrich Rebbe, says, my husband was not only my husband, but he was my teacher. He was involved in every aspect of the domestic life of their home with her, shava b'shava. They would talk over the chinuch of the children. They would talk over the finances. She would sit with him to keep pushing the books of the Eitzon Achnosa. He was involved in every aspect of the respect that there was between the Rebbe MaHaRaSh and the Rebbe Tzendivke. And the Rebbe Tzendivke and the Rebbe MaHaRaSh is mamish unbelievable. There's so many stories, but there's no time. Tafresh Tetzvav, his chil b'Vayisrael. Tafresh Tetzvav, the Rebbe MaHaRaSh was 18. He started doing public service. He was a younger man. Now you must remember, it was such a hard time then in Russia. It was during the time of Nikolai Machshmei, yeah? The Gazette of the Cantonists was in full force. The decree of the Cantonists started at the beginning of the Tzemach Tzedek's Nesius, and it ended after he passed away. And the Cantonists was a mamish, a makalik suva batayra. It was a disease that in the Teichacha you don't have. They would take away children for 25 years of service. And they would come back, grown men, soldiers. You know what it means, a soldier? I'm sorry for saying it, behemoths. They were very good butchers, you understand? They were massive physical specimens. They spent their whole life in the army. And they knew how to kill. That's what they knew how to do. And how to march. That's all they knew. In other words, even they knew nothing. They didn't learn nish lahavdol teira. Nicht lahavo chochma, they were pasha trained to be soldiers. They were prosta Yidden. And the Cantonists could live any place they wanted in Russia. There was no gzeda for them, there was no tchum, there was no pale of settlement. So the Cantonists built communities wherever they wanted, and they used to schlep other Yidden to help them claimish. They helped a lot of Yidden relocate because of the pale of settlements. It was a tzara, a maket. Tzemach Tzedek used to say about the Cantonisten, as they were all starben by the tshuva, that they'll all die by the tshuva, kach have. Many of them died, Mesidas Nefesh al Kiddush Hashem b'Peil, you all know the stories. It's a terrible time. Then you had the Pale of Settlements. The Pale of Settlements basically meant that Jews not allowed to live in certain places if they were near borders or if they were near big cities, because they were not trusted. And then Jews were hated for not being productive. You didn't let them anywhere near a business. You didn't let them near a road. You didn't let them anywhere near a railroad. And then you're complaining, how come they're primitive? And to top it all off, God forbid, Jews showed success, they would change the settlements. They'd move the borders. So Jews finally established, it's built, it's happened again and again and again. It was a time of phenomenal tzaras. And in the earlier years, Tzemach Tzedek Pashat was involved himself. In Tafresh Gimel, he went himself to Peterborough. He had chassidim who worked with him. There's a famous chassid who worked at Tzemach Tzedek with the Cantonisten. And he actually went to jail. There was a chassid who sat in jail for 8 years because they kidnapped children. And he wouldn't say for Shteitzach that he was doing it on behalf of the Rebbe. He had the chassid sit in jail instead of the Rebbe. I guess of moment. It was such a difficult time. As soon as the Rebbe became of age, his father put him in charge of the Askonos. Just like the Frierdiker Rebbe. Frierdiker Rebbe became an Asken Tziburi at 15. The Rebbe MaHaRaSh became Asken Tziburi at 20. He had 6 older brothers. He was the youngest of 7 men, 7 boys. And there were 2 son-in-laws also. The Rebbe MaHaRaSh chose him. Why? Because upon him, apparently not all brothers are created equal. The Rebbe MaHaRaSh spoke many, many languages. And he gave the impression of being a soicher, a merchant, a businessman. And of course we all know that the Rebbe MaHaRaSh made a lot of money in government lotteries. Tzemach Tzedek used to buy lottery tickets, and the Rebbe MaHaRaSh used to buy lottery tickets. And they found a pidyon where the Tzemach Tzedek is writing to the Eibishter that my son should win and not I. The MaHaRaSh won a number of government lotteries. He had a lot of money. He used to invest it, and he lived very, very rich. There was, by the Rebbe MaHaRaSh, the only one of the Chabad Rabbeim. We had a Hanhaga of Ashiris by the Rebbe MaHaRaSh. So it was all a front. He traveled officially on business, but the bottom line of all of his travels was Askonos Tziburis. Fana before the Bavusta Maise, where he once walked into his father, and his father was crying, and his instinctive question was, "What's the Nayik Zeder?" He walks into his father, and his father is crying, says to him, "What's the latest decree?" 20, he became involved in his father's public service, and he traveled. Tzemach Tzedek trusted him. And there were a lot of things Tzemach Tzedek needed done that probably in an earlier time he had to do himself. Now he was able to send the Rebbe MaHaRaSh. And of course, Tafresh Zayin, they said, Lepetabak b'nei Aklal. Tafresh Zayin is 1857. Tafresh Tes, they say, Ashkenaz. He traveled to Germany, Lisrais and Maskane Atzibur, also because of the anti-Semitism in Russia. Tafresh Chav Gimel, they say, Kiev. They were pushed, throwing Jews out of their lands. You know why? Because the Jews had built it up and made it successful, and it was the easiest thing to do. The Jews are not allowed to live here because they're not trustworthy. Let them start over. And the Rabbeim have suffered with these Yidden Nochanand all the time. Tafresh Chav Hey, right, the same thing. They say Peterburg. They wanted to put weiter. This was a constant. The anti-Semitism was so not veiled. It wasn't even pretended to be justified. It was Pashut anti-Semitism. Fight got Yidden. And they just never stopped. Always a Gzeira, Naya Gzeira, Naya Gzeira. And at the end of the Tzemach Tzedek's life, the Rebbe MaHaRaSh was doing a lot of traveling for him. And of course we all know the Bavusta Maise, which I want to share with you. And that's the Maise with the Belzer of Sholem Belzer. That during the course of his travels, he was in Galicia. And he stopped off in Belz, went to Belzer of Bismedish. The Belzer Rebbe was blind. That's the first Belzer Rebbe. Anyway, walked into the shul being led by his Shamish. And as soon as he comes into the Beis HaMedrash, he starts walking towards the Rebbe MaHaRaSh. So the MaHaRaSh starts walking away, so he chases him. This is a blind man, you understand, until he finally catches him. And he grabs him, he says, Wer ist dus? Who is this? And the Hasidim tell the Belzer Rebbe, he's a modern Jew, he doesn't look like a Hasidish, he looks like a businessman. So he says, Ki toiv sachra mikol schreire, he tells him. But this is not in Chabad, this is the Belzer tell this story. He's a Seicher, but what's his schreire? What's he selling? He's selling Teira. Toiv sachra, the best of schreire is Teira. Anyway, he took the Rebbe MaHaRaSh with him and he sat him down next to him. And he told the Rebbe MaHaRaSh he should give Shirayim to the Belzer Chassidim. So he found out that this is the Tzemach Tzedek's kind. So he asked him to give Shirayim. So the Rebbe MaHaRaSh said, Shirayim? You want to talk stocks and bonds? You can talk to me, Shirayim. So the Belzer Rebbe leaned over and in a few seconds he taught him say that Shirayim. He spoke very fast. He taught him say, and the MaHaRaSh gave Shirayim to the Belzer Chassidim. When he came back to Lubavitch, he was very, very impressed. And he told the Tzemach Tzedek what happened. And Tzemach Tzedek's response to him was, Vos, von a offene Bal Ruach HaKedesh has getracht zu behalten. You thought you can hide from someone who has such open eyes, such Ruach HaKedesh. Now, the Rebbe Tzachai Mushke passed away in Tafish Chaf Aleph in 1860-61. The Rebbe MaHaRaSh Tzemach Tzedek got sick almost immediately. For 5 years, the Rebbe MaHaRaSh and his Rebbetzin and the children took care of the Rebbe Tzemach Tzedek. It says that the children, all the sons, took turns being mishamish their father. Bottom line is they lived in the same house. And there's a number of stories that happened before the Tzemach Tzedek passed away. One of them is that the Tzemach Tzedek told the Rebbe MaHaRaSh to start saying MaMarim from the beginning of the year. Tzemach Tzedek passed away before Pesach, Yud Gimel Nissi. He told the Rebbe MaHaRaSh to start saying Chassidus that Tishrei. And we actually have printed, not a lot, but some MaMarim from the Rebbe MaHaRaSh, which he started to write and to say before his father passed away. Tzemach Tzedek insisted that he should start saying Chassidus B'Chayov. The Rebbe MaHaRaSh was not comfortable with it, but he did it. And B'chlal, the MaMarim from the Rebbe MaHaRaSh, the Rebbe MaHaRaSh used to write his father's MaMarim. He used to write Hanochas, his father's MaMarim. And the MaMarim, it's not been printed. One of the largest bodies of Chassidus today, which remains not printed, is the Tzemach Tzedek's Hanochas, MaMarim Tzemach Tzedek's times. The Tzemach Tzedek used to not write MaMarim, he used to write only the Shemis, he used to write only notes. The long hand of the MaMarim was written by the Rebbe MaHaRaSh and by the Rebbe Kalsker and the people of Parachim. They have yet to be printed, but the Rebbe MaHaRaSh used to write his father's MaMarim, and a lot of MaMarim we have from the Rebbe MaHaRaSh are his father's MaMarim. His father's, as he writes them out in longhand, he develops his father's MaMarim. He was told by his father to start saying MaMarim during that winter. Number two, there's a printed tzavah. It's in one version of it is Taked Ayem Yem, and there's also in the Tzevatos, the Rebbe MaHaRaSh, a number of drafts. The tzavah, it's 4 lines. Lebni Harav Shmuel Sheyichir, to my son Harav Shmuel Sheyichir. I saw your Chassidus, and it made me very happy. And I'm repeating to you in writing what I heard, what I told you about Peh. Open your mouth and let your words shine. And then he says, he says, I heard from my Alter Rebbe. It's a cryptic tzavah, but it's short 4 lines, and the kudah is he wants that the Rebbe MaHaRaSh should say Chassidus. And there's apparently 3 or 4 different versions of this tzavah. I've seen a number of versions, but this is the version that we all know. And finally, I'll tell you this story: that the Rebbe MaHaRaSh had geld, he had money, so people came to him for milk, for loans. He had either a sister-in-law or a niece who used to borrow money from him from time to time. One day, she comes into the house and she asks the Rebbetzin, Rivke vu Shmuel. She called him by his first name. She asked the Rebbetzin where he is. So she says, Bam Shved. He's by her father-in-law that says by the Tzemach Tzedek, his father. The 2 houses were adjacent, they were mamish attached, and she was mishpacha, so she walked from the Rebbe MaHaRash's dira into the Tzemach Tzedek's dira. She comes to Tzemach Tzedek's dira, Tzemach Tzedek's cheder yechidus is open, and you can hear a conversation. And the Tzemach Tzedek is telling the Rebbe MaHaRash, Zetz chavek auf ishto, sit down on my chair. And the Rebbe MaHaRash says, Ich kann nicht. I can't. And the Tzemach Tzedek says, I command you, sit down on my seat. And the Rebbe MaHaRaSh says, I can't. It happened a few times. He says, I'm commanding you, you should sit down on my seat. So the Rebbe MaHaRaSh says, I can't. So finally he says, if you refuse to sit on my seat, you'll have tzaddas later. That's the way it ended. And then the Rebbe MaHaRaSh walks out, and there she is. She stood in the hallway and heard the whole exchange. She understood exactly what she's listening to. But the Rebbe Tzemach Tzedek Poshet was memane him out his mamala makom. And he sees her and he says to her, Du wirst mir mamshech sein rufen Shmuel. My name is going to continue to be Shmuel, and no one is going to know what you just heard behind the door. She kept her word until the Tzemach Tzedek was nostalgic. After that Tzemach Tzedek passed away, she was mefarsim. The bottom line is, he took a had tzaddas, because 4 other brothers became his competition. Let's read inside. Tofresh Chavav Mekabel Ansiyas. Tofresh Chavav is Mekabel upon himself the Ansiyas. And like I said to you before, his father passed away out of Pesach. He started saying Chasidus the winter earlier, based on a Eirah from his father. But the Ansiyas is Mekabel when his father passed away. There's a very powerful story in the Neshimis where the Rebbe said a maimer. And the next day the Maril said the same maimer with a beer. Maril was the second of the Tzemach Tzedek's children, and he was the most famous Rebbe. He left Lubavitch that summer. He lived 6 months past his father. When he walked out of Lubavitch, the Rebbe MaHaRaSh stood in the window and he watched him leading his older brother. His brother was 30 years older than him, out of Lubavitch, and he cried and he said, "Man führt auf mein Bruder auf a kurzen Weg." They're leading my brother on a very short trip. He passed away 6 months after the Tzemach Tzedek. And there's a Nechama Veilum letter, so bitter, from the Rebbe MaHaRaSh to his son, Shlomo Kapostad. How could be consulted? They just lost the Tzemach Tzedek, and now his son the Maril. So the Maril said a maimer based on Tzemach Tzedek's maimer with a Taisus beer. So that night the Rebbe MaHaRaSh said again a maimer with an additional beer on his brother's beer. The next day the Maril said a maimer on the maimer on the maimer on the maimer. This went back and forth. After a number of times, the Rebbe MaHaRaSh said the Maimer, and the Maril did not follow. So they came to the Maril. Maril had a very large team. He had the biggest support. No, it's not good for the business. How come you're not responding? Hat gesagt, dem Mol der Tate gerät. An kegen Taten stelle sich nicht. He says, this time the father, the Tzemach Tzedek, spoke. I'm not standing up against. Dem Mol, yeah? The Tzemach Tzedek used to give every one of his children a nickname. One he called mein Landen, one he called mein Ovid, one he called mein Balambos, one he called mein Maskell. Each one had a name, and the name meant something. So once a group of Hasidim was sitting with the same Maril, and they're talking about his brothers, and this one is a Gon and Niglas, a Gon and Nister. And somebody sort of said, but the youngest one is Epesnish, the youngest one is the businessman, the man. He says, the youngest one, Kulu Isnube. He has every mile. Ala milas. After the Tzemach Tzedek passed away, he was a very, very big dictator over the Ksavim. He was a huge dictator over what to do with the Ksavim. Tzemach Tzedek's children, you understand, the 3 Rabbonim who sat on that dictator were Ge'ena Yelam, the Peretz Chain, the base of Tamarkin, and the B'Shem Zalman Fratkin and Teretz Chesed. They were the Dayanim. During the dictator, the Rebbe MaHaRaSh revealed Ge'oinus Atzum and Nigle, Poshet, in Halachas of Yerusha. The Marshaz, who was his first father-in-law, who was 20 years older than him, says to the Rebbe MaHaRaSh, you're 32 years old, how do you know so much Torah? He was in his 50s already. It's like a younger man. It's like the Rebbe MaHaRaSh, du bist älter in deine Jahre, und ich bin älter in Tatens Jahre. This is the famous quote. You're older than me because you were born before, but I'm older than you because I was born when our father was older. In the Tatens Jahre. Anyway, the Rebbe MaHaRaSh stayed in Lubavitch and everybody else left. One by one they left. The Marin made a comment. One of the brothers said, the Tata said I should stay in Lubavitch even if I get no covet. But he didn't say I should stay in Lubavitch even if I suffer bushes. The Chassidim took sides. And it wasn't enough that you held with one over the other, you had to go and fight with the other. You understand? Sie gewinnen Peides, Menschen sind gestorben. Sie gewinnen Sakonis. Within 2 or 3 years they all left. The Maril moved to Kopost, Chaim Shadam moved to Liadi, Ibn Shalech moved to Nezh. And the MaHaRaSh stayed in Lubavitch. And the Ksavim stayed in Lubavitch. He was Meisei Nefesh to keep the Ksavim. The only brother who stayed in Lubavitch was the oldest, Rabbi Shalom, who was our Rebbe's Zayda's. Zayda, he stayed in Lubavitch. He didn't become a Rebbe, and Kidu Adavart, he became Pishnaim. The MaHaRaSh became a Rebbe. Rebbe MaHaRaSh had a tiny oilam. He had no chassidim. They say the first Rosh Hashanah had a problem with a minyan. Rosh Hashanah. The MaHaRaSh had it off from his father to say chassidus. Et nicht gehatz of Emin. So he had a collection of hats. He used to put down the hats. And das is Shmuel Ber, and das is David Hirsch, and das is Peretz, and das is Yosef. And he would say chassidus to the hats. Very, very small crowd. But the kid of all of us, the love and the affection that there was between the MaHaRaSh and his chassidim, and the chassidim, the MaHaRaSh was a very strong discussions. Tafresh Chavchas, 1858. Neisea leTzarfat, he traveled to France, to meet public servants about the tzadus in Russia. And of course, Tafresh Chavtes, Misader Vat Kavur bePeterburg, he appoints a permanent commission in Peterburg. The Rebbe MaHaRaSh was a first-class Askan Ziburi. The Tzemach Tzedek was also a public servant, but he did everything quietly. Tzemach Tzedek used to make believe he's a batlin. Everyone thought he doesn't know what's going on. He did everything quietly. But the Rebbe MaHaRaSh was a real public... You know who we worked with? With the covenant of Harav Yitzchak Elchanan Spector. He was a Litvak, a Elam Sharav. He was a very, very big public servant. He was the greatest public servant of Jews in Russia in those years. And he worked hand in hand with the Rebbe MaHaRaSh. And there was a lot of derech eretz. There was a lot of mutual respect. And they worked together. The Rebbe MaHaRaSh was the Rebbe, but the covenant of was very, very involved in Kodesh Siburis. Somebody who knows told me that even when the Rebbe MaHaRaSh passed away, the Rebbe Rashab wrote a letter that as long as the covenant of was alive, I didn't have to be involved. I trusted him. He passed away in the 1890s, and his son no longer had that chush, and that's when the Rebbe Rashab got involved in Kodesh Siburis. But the covenant of Yitzchak Spector was very involved, and the Rebbe MaHaRaSh was such difficult times, and they were constantly fighting the government. So he set up a permanent representation in Petersburg. Some of them were probably lawyers, which meant they were not even from people, to work on his behalf to help Jewish people keep their homes and keep their lives and keep their livelihood and so on. And of course, the famous story was one of these trips there was a fire in Lubavitch and his own house burned to the ground. And he was having terrible tzaddas because there was a movement of the Paltiel settlement. They took away from 50 communities of Jews, their rights of habitation. They all had to move. And the Rebbe's own house burned to the ground. So they didn't know what to do. So finally the Rebbe MaHaRaSh wrote a letter, and in the letter he wrote diagrams how they should rebuild his house. And where they should get the wood from, and where they should get the money from. So they understood that without being told, he knew already everything that happened with his house. And he says, and don't worry about time, I'm not coming home for Tishrei. He spent Tishrei in Kishinev. And during that Tishrei, he insisted that these three communities, Kishinev and Odessa and Altiri, that they didn't have to bail out 50 communities of Jews. And the Gan Tzarichas HaSipor, how he was ma'ated them to eat from Mesiras Nefesh V'Tzedakah and so forth. Tafresh Mem, 1880, Hishtadol Upol Ashkotas HaProis. He invested himself and he effected the quieting of the pogroms. The first wave of American Jews coming to America was 1880s. And they came from Russia. Because in 1881, 82, Russia was unstable. And whenever Russia was unstable, the Russian government used to organize pogroms from the Tsar himself. And they would kill Jews all over Russia. And it kept the peasants happy. Killing Jews and taking their property was a preoccupation. It was a full-time job. So they stopped hating the government, you understand. You know, there's a famous book, The Elders of Zion. You know who wrote that book? The Russian government, then, in the 1880s. The Nazis used to quote it. The Arabs, quoted it. It was commissioned by the Tsar. Anti-Semitism, it was institutionalized anti-Semitism. And hundreds of thousands of Jews ran to America. And that's when they had the first immigration, Bilu it was called. Jews left to Israel, what they called Aliyah Rishonah, they called it, the first Aliyah. And a lot of Frum people went Yemelt to Israel in the early 1880s to get away from Russia. The Rebbe MaHaRaSh said Yemelt that if they would add the two words B'Eir Hashem, Bilu, Beis Yankel, Chuvanelcha, if they would add the two words B'Eir Hashem, he would join them. The bottom line is that Rebbe MaHaRaSh did not run from Russia. He fought against the pogroms. How? It's a famous story. He went to Peterburg, And he had a hard time arranging a meeting, but he met the Minister of Interior, the Minister of State, and he said to him, what's going on with these pogroms? He says, I'll see what I can do. He says, what do you mean you're going to see? They're spilling Jewish blood. He says, listen, it's a complicated bureaucratic problem. He instigated the ganze Weiss. So MaHaRaSh got on a train, he traveled to Berlin, and the next day in the big German papers, and the big French papers, there were big articles that Russia's killing Jews, and they're not protecting their Jewish citizens, and there were announcements in these big international papers about boycotts against Russia for anti-Semitism. He got back on the train and went back to Petersburg. This time they were waiting for him. He says, you are made it b'malchus. You undermine the government. He says, wegen sich trachte ich in ganze nicht. About my own life I'm not thinking at all. He says, but don't think you're going to spill Jewish blood and I'm going to spy and watch. The pogrom stopped. And the MaHaRaSh lost his life. In the Rebbe's diary, it's written that the Rebbe MaHaRaSh said he was Mesa Nefesh for the pogroms to stop. And there's so many beautiful stories. There's a story with a lawyer who was an elderly man, and he met the Friedrich Rebbe. And the Friedrich Rebbe and the MaHaRaSh looked identically. He says, are you Schneerson? He says, yeah. He says, I want to tell you a story. And he tells him how he worked with the Rebbe MaHaRaSh some 40 or 50 years earlier. There's a famous story. He called together a meeting of Askani Tzibur, and he started to tell them what to do. You do this and you do this. So one of them said to him, Lubavitcher Rebbe, with all due respect, we're not your chassidim. We are professionals, we're successful people. Mit uns darf man sich durchreden. You don't tell us what to do, you consult with us. So the Rebbe MaHaRaSh told him, Hezechaim, steht in the Megillah Esther. Im MaHaRaSh tacharishi be'eis hazeis. Revach v'atzolah lamad ha'yehudu v'moka macher v'ato beis havichte v'edu. He says, the Eibush is going to help Yidden. You'll miss the opportunity. V'ato beis havichte v'edu. The help will come from someplace else. The Rebbe MaHaRaSh left, and he made his own commission with his chassidim. And he took young lawyers, Freie. And one of these young lawyers worked with the Rebbe MaHaRaSh that whole summer. He was in Lubavitch. He was so nispal from the Rebbe. The Rebbe's vision and his Avas Yisrael and his Breitkeit and his Chochmah. The Rebbe MaHaRaSh was a mamash melech. And then he read in the paper he passed away. He was so devastated, he said. He had just worked with him a whole summer. He passed away mamash. As soon as the story was finished, within weeks he was gone. And 50 years later, he repeated the story to the Friedrich Rebbe, described he was a young lawyer, he was a young upstart. The Rebbe had hired him, had taken him on to work with him, and how beautiful that period had been. And then boom, he reads in the paper how the Rebbe Nitar. So here it says, what does it say next? Monday night, passed away at Gimel Tishrei. Erev Rosh Hashanah, he called in his wife. And the Rebbe said once, he said it in Tafshin and Beis, that the Rabbi had a minig Erev Rosh Hashanah to go in and talk to the Rebbetzin, Mitzadiyim from Malchus. That year he called in the Rebbetzin and he said to her, Du wirst haben Lamed Beis Aliyas Lamato, and ich will haben Lamed Beis Aliyas Lamaylo. You'll have 32 ascents down here, and I'm going to have 32 ascents up there. She understood the immediate implication, and she said, Was redst du, hast noch junge Kinder? What are you saying? You have little children. They had a daughter, Chaya Mushke, she was probably 5 or 6. And the MaHaRaSh said he gave his life for the pogroms to stop. He passed away at Gimel Tishrei. He gave them each a bracha. He called them each one of his 6 children. He gave them a bracha. The last one was Taki, this Chaya Mushke. This Chaya Mushke was the Mechatenist of the Friedrich Rebbe. She was the mother of Menachem Mendel Akei in Horestein. She died in Treblinka in 1942. Her name was Chaya Mushke. She was named after the Rebbe, Tzemach Tzedek's Rebbe. And he said to his little girl, Ich hab die gedacht, fit into the chuppah. In other words, the plans as the Eibishter made them, I was supposed to take you to the chuppah, but now the plans have changed. And he gave her a bracha, and then he was nistalek. This is the Rebbe MaHaRaSh. This is the story of the Rebbe MaHaRash's life. There's a lot more to tell, but this is what it says here. Now let's just read quickly. Bonov, Harav Shnei Zalman Aaron. Zalman Aaron, this gets his Tamas Tov Reish Tes, Yirav Machas Tov Reish Samach Tes. He is the eldest. The second one is the Rebbe Rashab, and the third is the Avram Sender. He is the enigma. Avram Sender died at the age of 8. And the Friedrich Rebbe writes about him, Harav Tzadik Hayelad of Avram Sender. You don't write by a child Tzadik, because you don't get the neshama till Bar Mitzvah. By him it says Hayelad Tzadik. He passed away at 8 with Mamish Moich and the Godless, like a Tzadik, like an adult. in the Sefer that told us that MaHaRaSh said that Tzemach Tzedek was there, but it looks like Avram Sender was younger. He was the third son. It's hard to know. If he was the third son, then he was obviously younger than the Rebbe Rashab. The Rebbe Rashab was 5 when the Tzemach Tzedek passed away, so Avram Sender was even younger. But when he passed away, the Tzemach Tzedek said, this is the Neshama of the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe was supposed to live 8 years before, and he also passed away young. Mitzad the Inyan for Napoleon, and this was the Tzemach Tzedek, MaHaRaSh's third son of Avram Sender. And they have for him a tzion in Lubavitch. They made for him an oil. And the fourth is the Rabbi Menachem Mendel, Zayin HaTov Ishchav Zayin. That's when he was born. And he passed away in 1947, I believe, after the war, in Corsica. The Frierdiker Rebbe used to correspond with him. He had a very, very hard life. He had to run away from Russia because of business dealings. He had a very hard life. He was married 4 times. His children were not frum. And they, in France, after 25 years, they just buried people on top of one another. And they wanted to exhume him. His children wouldn't. So, in 1956, our Rebbetzin went over there to Corsica and posed as his daughter. She had the same name, Schneerson. Her maiden name was Schneerson. They literally snuck his body out of France in the middle of the night. They brought it to Tzfat. There's a sefer called Liban Shel Tzfat. It's a book that somebody made about Bistritsky's son, Levi Olav Shalom. And in that book he describes how there was a grave in the Chabad Chelke in Tzfas that was unmarked. And it belonged to the Rebbe MaHaRaSh's youngest son, Rabbi Menachem Mendel, whose body was moved 10 years after he had passed away, and the goof was whole. The body was whole, and it was unmarked for many years. And Levi was just kept asking the Rebbe if it's okay to put a marker. It looks like the Rebbe wanted to wait till his children passed away. Now there's already a marker. The Rebbe finally allowed they should put a marker. The MaHaRaSh Kind, he's buried in Tzfas. This is Menachem Mendel. Then there were 2 daughters. The Veda Leah, she may have been the oldest. She was married to Meisha Ayaleib Ginsburg, was a Greise Gvir in Vitebsk. And somebody told me that in the last years, a Russian politician, a guy with the name Ginsburg, turns up, a Einikel from dem MaHaRaSh. And he's a Oyev Yisrael. He's not Jewish, but he's an Einikel from dem MaHaRaSh. And then, of course, there was Chaya Mushke, her husband Moshe Kain Horenstein. She was the Frierdiker Rebbe's Muchatenester, like I told you. Her son was Menachem Mendel HaKoyen, and they died in Treblinka. Okay, Umesaymen B'Tev.